The Curse of the Blue Figurine by John Bellairs, Chapter 7. The next day after school, Johnny went to the public library and consulted the Unabridged Dictionary. The Unabridged was fun to use. It was a very thick and floppy book, and it stood on a swiveling wooden stand in a corner of the reference room. A lot of its definitions were strange and interesting, and the book was full of pictures of weird objects, like arbalists and brassards and undershot water wheels. Johnny flipped straight to the T's because he had seen a picture of an Egyptian god. There, at least he thought he had. He was right. Here it was, a picture of the god Thoth. Thoth was a funny-looking thing. He had the body of a man and the head of an ibis, which is a hook-beaked bird that looks sort of like a heron. Thoth held in his hands a bunch of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The dictionary said that Thoth was the god of magic and mathematics. He would be good use to one in the game Johnny was going to play with the blue figurine. Johnny copied the name Thoth down on a notepad he had brought with him. Then, idly, he flipped a couple of pages and found himself staring at the picture of another Egyptian god. This one was even more weird-looking. Her name was Turis. She had the body of a pregnant woman. Her head was the head of a hippopotamus. Turis, according to the dictionary, was the goddess of childbirth and of revenge. The revenge part was what interested Johnny. He copied Turis's name down, closed the book, and went home. That evening after dinner, Grandpa asked Johnny about his ring. He had noticed it the first time Johnny had showed up with it on, but he had not said anything then. "That's really some ring, Johnny," said Grandpa amiably, as he sprinkled salt on his mashed potatoes. "Where'd you get it?" Johnny's hand had been resting on the table. Now, for some reason, he jerked it away and hid it under the tablecloth. He felt shy about the ring. In school, kids had noticed it, and at first they had made fun of it, claiming that it looked like a woman's engagement ring. To stop the kidding, Johnny had come up with a pretty snappy explanation. He claimed that the ring was a Captain Midnight Death Ray ring. He said that he had gotten it by sending in Ovaltine labels, but he did not think that an explanation like this would work on Grandpa. The professor gave it to me," said Johnny, glancing away evasively. Grandpa stared wonderingly at Johnny for a minute. He could not understand why Johnny was so nervous about the ring. Could Johnny have stolen it? No, Grandpa told himself. That didn't seem very likely. Johnny was not the thieving kind. Grandpa was curious, but he was not the sort of person who would give you the third degree. So he just dropped the subject and started talking about baseball. That night, Johnny dreamed a lot. At first, he dreamed that he was a moth, fluttering about on a summer night. He kept hovering outside a lighted window, and through the window he could see Mr. Beard, the little man he had met in church. The man was sitting at a table reading, but no matter how much Johnny the Moth beat at the window with his wings, the man never looked up. Then the dream shifted, and Johnny was outside R. Bart's antique store. He went in as before, and there was the horrible old lady in the green eye-shade, but this time, instead of trying to drag him down into the grave beside the counter, she chased him around and around the shop, up steep, rickety staircases, down long, dark hallways lined with dusty bureaus and bookcases and looming dark bedsteads. Johnny awoke around 3 in the morning, and he felt exhausted and strangely nervous. He got up, put on his slippers and bathrobe, and padded down the stairs. He tried the front door, but it was locked, tight as always. Then Johnny stood in the front hall listening. It was a still night. The apple tree outside the hall window hung perfectly motionless, but for some reason the house was making noise. All old houses make noises at night. Creaks and cracks and pops. But this was different. It was a rustling noise, a strange, ghostly whispering. As Johnny listened, the noise died away, and the house was silent again. Eyes wide with wonder and fear, Johnny turned toward the stairs and slowly began to climb. Johnny did not get much sleep that night. He kept waking up and glancing anxiously around, straining to hear strange sounds. The next morning, he stood at his bureau in his rumpled pajamas. The face that stared back at him from the bureau mirror was red-eyed and woozy. On the clean white runner lay the ring Mr. Beard had given him. Johnny picked the ring up and turned it over in his hands. After the dreams he had had and the sounds he had heard at night, he was beginning to wonder about the little game that Mr. Beard wanted him to play. Mr. Beard was a nice man, that was certainly true, and he was only trying to help Johnny. But what if the figurine really was magic? What if Eddie's broken arm hadn't been just a coincidence? Johnny fussed and fumed and thought some more, and as he thought, he slipped the ring onto his finger. He looked at himself in the mirror and blinked. Things were suddenly clearer. How silly all his doubts and fears were. He ought to go ahead and play with the magic game. He ought to go ahead with the magic game. If he played the game, it would make him feel stronger and braver, and then he would be stronger and braver, just like Mr. Beard had said. Johnny went to the closet and opened the door. He knelt down and took the blankets and magazines and sweatshirts off the black book. He opened the lid and took the figurine out. Holding it in his hands, he said the prayer that he had made up. Thoth, attend me. Torres, be my avenger. Let those who oppose me beware, for I will make them rue the day when they raise their hands against me. By the name of Amun-Ra, I swear it. Johnny paused. If he was expecting magical fireworks, he was disappointed. The blue figurine smiled up at him as always, but it looked and felt exactly the way it always had. No voices spoke to him out of the air. No thunder rolled. No dark clouds came rushing in to hide the morning sun. Johnny felt slightly silly. He was glad there wasn't anyone in the room watching him. This is a dumb idea, he muttered to himself. It isn't going to make me braver or anything. He got up and started peeling off his pajama top. It would be time for school to go to school soon. When Johnny walked into the church that morning, he suddenly remembered that it was the first day of May. On the altar were fresh flowers, and 6 tall candles were lit. May meant processions, with kids marching solemnly around the church, and hymns and incense and organ music. That was all right with Johnny. He loved parades and processions. Later, after Mass, Johnny was up in the 7th grade classroom sitting at his desk. Sister Electa had not called the class to order yet. In fact, she was not even in the room. So everybody was just talking and goofing off. With his finger, Johnny idly drew circles in the layer of polish on the top of his desk. For no reason at all, his prayer book popped into his head. Johnny was very proud of his prayer book. His dad had given it to him as a going-away present before he had sent Johnny off to live with Grandma and Grandpa in Dunstan Heights. Johnny used the prayer book every day. It had a black cover of genuine leather with a gold cross stamped on the spine. The pages were made of onion skin paper, thin and whispery, and the top edge of each page was gilded, so that when the book was closed, a glimmering gold bar shone out at you. There were illustrations all through the book, and fancy capital letters, and there were 2 bookmark ribbons, one purple, the other red. The prayer book was one of Johnny's prized possessions. It felt good to hold the book in his hands. Smiling, he reached down to the briefcase that stood on the floor next to his desk. The prayer book was in there with his other books, but Johnny's smile faded when he saw the clasp on the briefcase was undone. Johnny was very fussy about that clasp. He always did it up after he had taken something out of the briefcase, so it seemed pretty likely that somebody had been fooling around with his stuff. Alarmed, Johnny reached down and lifted the briefcase up into his lap. He opened the flap and peered inside. He could hardly believe it. His prayer book was gone. Angry tears sprang to Johnny's eyes. Who could have done such a dirty, rotten thing? His mind began to race. Had the briefcase been out of his sight this morning? Johnny thought hard. He had had it with him in the pew this morning, and then he had brought it over to the school, and since then he had been sitting here at his desk, except for one brief trip to the pencil sharpener. So who? Then it came to him. Phil Abson, the kid behind him. Phil Abson was a weird kid. There was something wrong with his head, so he did strange things and said strange things. Grandma had often said, grumblingly, that Phil was proof of the fact that Catholic schools would take anybody. Johnny didn't like Phil much, but he didn't dislike him much either. And up until now, he hadn't figured that Phil was a thief. Johnny turned and looked at Phil. He was pretending to be very busy, leafing madly through his geometry book. When Phil saw Johnny giving him the fisheye, he got even busier. It seemed pretty plain to Johnny that Phil was the guilty one. Who else could it be? Johnny felt his face getting flushed. Anger was building up inside him. He wanted to grab Phil by the collar and shake the truth out of him. "Hey, Phil!" he began loudly. "Did you—" But then Sister Electa's voice cut in. She was summoning them all to attention. She was asking them all to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Johnny bit his lip. He turned and got up. He would settle with Phil later. All through the first 2 morning classes, Johnny steamed about his missing prayer book. He kept hoping that Sister Electa would leave the room so he could turn around and give Phil holy hell. Johnny was scared of kids like Eddie Tompke, but he was not scared of Phil. Phil was a real wimp, and even Johnny could terrorize him if he set his mind to it. And if Sister Electa left the room, Johnny would terrorize him. He would turn around and grab Phil's arm and squeeze it and make him give the prayer book back. It would be as simple as that, at least Johnny hoped it would be. But the first two classes passed away, and Sister Electa... But the first two class periods passed, and Sister Electa never left the room. Then 11 o'clock came. It was time for religion class, but Sister had a surprise for everyone. Instead of holding the regular class, she announced, they and all the other students were going over to the church to start rehearsing for the May procession. Some kids groaned, and Sister Electa glared sternly at them. Then she walked quickly to her desk and dinged the little handbell. Everybody stood up. And then, beginning with the row nearest the door, they began to file out of the room, just the way they did during a fire drill. A little later, Johnny was with the other kids, marching slowly around, 2 by 2, inside the vast, dark, echoing church. Nuns were rushing here and there, making sure that the lines were straight and bawling out kids who were fooling around. Mrs. Hawkster was playing the electric organ up in the choir loft, and the kids were singing, "Bring flowers of the fairest, bring flowers of the rarest, from garden and woodland and hillside and vale." As Johnny shuffled moodily along, he began to wonder why he had thought that processions were fun. This one was about as interesting as watching grass grow. Of course, it was only a rehearsal. They hadn't even chosen the girl who would crown the Blessed Virgin statue yet. Johnny wondered who they would choose. Probably Mary Jo Potter. The sisters were always the ones who got to choose the girl. And Mary Jo was so holy and pious and religious and sweet that it was sickening. The procession came to a sudden lurching, bumping stop. Something had gone wrong up front, though Johnny couldn't tell what. Now that the marching had stopped, he turned and began looking around in a vague, aimless way. Suddenly, he stopped. He had seen something that made him boiling mad. Halfway along the line stood Phil Abson, and he was holding Johnny's prayer book in his hands. Johnny had trouble controlling himself. He was a pretty mild-mannered kid most of the time, but when he lost his temper, he lost it. He knew that Phil was a little weak in the head, but all the same, this was too much. Just a little teeny bit too much. Johnny clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. He wanted to jump out of line and tear back there and snatch the book out of Phil's hands. But as angry as he was, he knew better than to do that. Sister Electa or some other nun would climb all over him if he started a fight in the church. So Johnny controlled his anger. There would be time to settle with good old Phil later. The rehearsal for the May procession only lasted an hour, but to Johnny it seemed like it went on forever. Finally, around noon, the nuns decided to call it quits. Streams of talking and laughing kids poured out through the 3 doors in the front of the church. Johnny went running out with the rest. He paused on the sidewalk, and he squinted and winced. After an hour in the dusty gloom of the church, the light made his nearsighted eyes hurt. But when the pain passed, Johnny found that, once again, he was staring at Phil Abson. There he was, out by the bicycle rack, with the prayer book under his arm. He had a very pious, prissy look on his face, and he was talking to Sister Electa. Well, this was just too much. Johnny took off on a run, and he didn't stop till he came to where the two of them were standing. "Hey, sister!" Johnny exclaimed breathlessly. "Phil stole my prayer book. That's my prayer book. Make him give it back." Phil stared at Johnny with wide, scared eyes. He clutched the prayer book the prayer book to his chest. "It's not his, sister. He's lying. This is my prayer book. My mom gave it to me." "I'm not a liar, but he is," Johnny yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Phil. "He's a dirty, rotten liar. Sister, make him give it back. It's mine. I swear to God it is." The kids, who had been standing and talking outside the church, now crowded around Phil and Johnny. They knew that something was up. Somebody was going to get in trouble, and they wanted to watch. And there we will pause.